Your kidneys, your liver, and your heart are older than you are, not in the sense that they were there before you, but in the sense that the biological age of these organs, measured by the actual condition of their tissue, their cellular machinery, and their functional capacity, is almost certainly ahead of the number on your birth certificate. This is not a metaphor, it is a measurable biological reality, documented across decades of research, present in the bodies of the majority of adults living ordinary modern lives, and almost entirely invisible to the people experiencing it, because the conventional tools of annual screening were designed to detect disease, not to detect the accelerated biological aging that precedes disease by years, sometimes decades. Before we go any further, if this channel gives you the kind of honest, evidence-based clarity that is genuinely difficult to find elsewhere, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. What I am going to walk you through today is why your three most vital organs are aging faster than your chronological age suggests they should, what is driving that acceleration, and most importantly, what the evidence shows about how meaningfully and how quickly that trajectory can be reversed. Let us begin with what biological aging of an organ actually means, because the concept is frequently invoked and rarely explained with the precision it deserves. Every organ in your body is composed of cells that divide, repair, and eventually exhaust their capacity for both. The biological age of an organ is a function of several interacting processes: the length and integrity of the telomeres that cap the chromosomes of its cells, the efficiency of its mitochondria, the degree of inflammatory damage accumulated in its tissue, the integrity of its vascular supply, and the extent to which its cells have accumulated the kind of oxidative and metabolic damage that impairs their function before it ends their life entirely. When these processes advance faster than chronological time would predict, driven by specific, modifiable environmental inputs, the organ performs at a level associated with a substantially older individual. It has less functional reserve, it recovers more slowly from stress, it is less capable of the compensatory responses that protect the body from the consequences of acute metabolic and physiological challenge, and it reaches the threshold of clinically detectable dysfunction years earlier than it would have in a more biologically supportive environment. A 2023 study published in Nature Aging used machine learning analysis of blood protein profiles to estimate the biological age of individual organs across a large adult population. The findings were striking. A significant proportion of participants had at least one organ whose biological age exceeded their chronological age by more than a decade, and the organs most frequently identified as prematurely aged were, in order of prevalence, the heart, the kidneys, and the liver, the three organs we are discussing today. The accelerated aging was not associated primarily with obvious disease or dramatic lifestyle choices. It was associated with the cumulative effect of the ordinary, unremarkable inputs of modern daily life: diet quality, sleep duration, inflammatory load, metabolic stress, applied consistently and relentlessly across years and decades. This is the most important framing for everything that follows. The premature aging of your organs is not happening because of catastrophic choices. It is happening because of ordinary ones, applied at a frequency and a duration that the biology was not designed to sustain. Understanding that reframes the intervention as well. You do not need extraordinary measures to slow this process. You need consistent, evidence-based corrections to the specific inputs driving it. But before you can make those corrections with the seriousness they deserve, you need to understand what is actually happening in each of these three organs, and why the standard picture of health that most people are carrying bears so little resemblance to the biological reality. Let us begin with the kidneys, because renal aging is perhaps the most underappreciated of the three stories, and because the research on how dramatically modifiable it is has not yet penetrated the public conversation the way it deserves to. Your kidneys age through a combination of processes that compound each other in ways that the standard creatinine measurement, the primary tool used to assess renal function in routine clinical practice, is poorly equipped to detect until the decline is already significant. The glomeruli, the microscopic filtration units that do the actual work of cleaning the blood, are present in finite number from birth, approximately 1 million per kidney. They do not regenerate. When they are damaged or lost, the surviving glomeruli compensate by increasing their individual filtration rate, a process called hyperfiltration that sustains overall kidney function in the short term, but accelerates the structural damage of the surviving units over time. The result is a progressive, self-amplifying cycle of glomerular loss and compensatory stress that the biology cannot ultimately win, but that it can sustain for a remarkably long time before conventional measurements are affected. What accelerates this cycle beyond the pace of normal chronological aging? 4 specific inputs, each of them common, each of them measurable, and each of them modifiable. The first is chronic elevation of blood pressure, even within the range that most clinical guidelines classify as high normal rather than hypertensive. The mechanical stress of pressure elevation on the delicate capillaries of the glomerular filtration units is constant and cumulative, and a sustained blood pressure of 130/85, a reading that many people and many clinicians accept as adequate, is driving measurably faster glomerular aging than a pressure of 115/75 across every hour of every day. A 2020 study in the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology found that adults with high normal blood pressure showed significantly faster rates of eGFR decline over 10 years compared to adults with optimal pressure, independent of age, body weight, and all other conventional risk factors. The kidneys were aging faster, the blood pressure was within accepted ranges, and the standard annual check was not capturing the distinction. The second input accelerating renal aging is chronic dehydration, not the acute dehydration of physical exertion in heat, but the sustained low-level fluid deficit that characterizes the daily habits of a substantial proportion of adults who simply do not drink adequate water across the course of an ordinary day. The kidneys regulate fluid balance continuously, and when chronically undersupplied, they operate in a state of sustained concentration that increases the osmotic stress on tubular cells, raises the concentration of waste products in the renal collecting system, and reduces the perfusion pressure that maintains glomerular filtration efficiency. A 2020 study in the American Journal of Nephrology found that low habitual fluid intake was independently associated with accelerated kidney function decline over a 5-year follow-up, and that increasing fluid intake in individuals with low baseline consumption produced measurable improvements in renal biomarkers within 12 weeks. Drinking adequate water is not a wellness cliché. It is one of the most direct renal anti-aging interventions available, and it is available at essentially zero cost. The third input is the dietary sodium load delivered primarily through ultra-processed food, which accounts for approximately 70% of sodium intake in populations where processed food is dietary dominant. Excess dietary sodium drives fluid retention, elevates blood pressure through volume expansion, and places direct mechanical stress on the glomerular filtration barrier that compounds the hypertensive damage we have already discussed. The kidneys compensate by increasing sodium excretion, a process that sustained chronically increases the energetic demand on renal tubular cells and accelerates their oxidative aging. Reducing dietary sodium is one of the most reliably renoprotective dietary interventions in the research literature, and the effect is additive to blood pressure control rather than simply redundant with it. The fourth input is hyperglycemia and insulin resistance. The metabolic environment in which elevated blood glucose and chronically elevated insulin combine to damage the glomerular endothelium and the mesangial cells that maintain the structural integrity of the filtration unit. This process, known as diabetic nephropathy in its advanced form, begins decades before any diabetes diagnosis, in the subclinical phase of insulin resistance, during which fasting glucose looks normal and the standard panel finds nothing to act on. A 2021 study in the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology found that fasting insulin elevation, independently of fasting glucose, was associated with measurably faster renal aging, and that the association was present well within the glucose ranges conventionally classified as normal. The kidneys are sensitive to the metabolic environment of insulin resistance years before that environment is formally identified as a clinical problem, and they are paying a biological price for that sensitivity every day that it goes unaddressed. Now let us turn to the liver and to the accelerated aging that the modern dietary and lifestyle environment is driving in an organ whose functional reserve is so extraordinary that the damage accumulates for years before any measurement reflects it. The liver ages through a combination of hepatocellular fat accumulation, mitochondrial dysfunction within liver cells, progressive fibrotic replacement of functional tissue, and the chronic inflammatory signaling that drives all three processes simultaneously. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the most common cause of premature hepatic aging in adults without heavy alcohol use, is present in approximately 25% of adults globally. Most of them are unaware. Most will not receive a diagnosis until liver enzyme levels have been elevated long enough to prompt investigation, and most will have been experiencing the biological consequences of accelerated hepatic aging for years before any clinical threshold is crossed. The accelerated aging of the liver shares several upstream drivers with the kidneys: insulin resistance, chronic inflammatory load, and sleep insufficiency, being among the most consistent, but has two additional inputs that are specific to hepatic biology and that deserve particular attention. The first is dietary fructose, delivered in liquid form through fruit juice, sweetened beverages, and the added sugars present in virtually every category of processed food. Fructose is metabolized almost exclusively in the liver through a pathway that generates reactive oxygen species, drives mitochondrial dysfunction in hepatocytes, and initiates the fat accumulation that is the earliest structural feature of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. A 2009 study in the Journal of Clinical Investigation demonstrated measurable hepatic fat accumulation and impaired insulin receptor signaling in liver tissue within 8 weeks of sustained liquid fructose intake at levels comparable to ordinary daily consumption habits. The liver was aging at an accelerated rate from inputs that most people would classify as moderate and unremarkable. The orange juice at breakfast, the sweetened coffee at mid-morning, the flavored water in the afternoon, each one individually modest, the cumulative hepatic burden substantial and daily. The second liver-specific input is the pharmaceutical load that most people do not think of in terms of organ aging, but that the research increasingly warrants considering seriously. Regular use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, statins without adequate nutritional co-support, and the cumulative metabolic burden of multiple concurrent medications, even individual, prescribed and clinically appropriate medications, places a sustained demand on the hepatic detoxification pathways that is energetically costly and oxidatively stressful. This is not an argument against medication when it is genuinely indicated. It is an argument for understanding the hepatic cost of a medication burden and for addressing the lifestyle inputs that reduce the need for pharmaceutical management wherever possible, not as an ideological position, but as a biological calculation that the liver's aging trajectory depends on. The mitochondria within liver cells are particularly vulnerable to the combined effects of fructose metabolism, chronic inflammation, and pharmaceutical processing, and their decline is central to the story of hepatic aging, because mitochondrial efficiency is the primary determinant of the liver's capacity to perform its 500 metabolic functions at the rate that the rest of the body's systems require. A 2021 paper in Cell Metabolism found that mitochondrial dysfunction was the earliest detectable feature of hepatic aging, present a decade or more before any fibrotic or structural change was visible on imaging and directly responsive to interventions targeting dietary fructose, inflammatory load, and sleep quality. The mitochondria were the canary, and the cage was the ordinary modern lifestyle. Now let us turn to the heart and to the cardiovascular aging that is, in terms of its clinical consequences, the most urgent of the three stories we are telling today. The heart ages through two parallel processes that are biologically distinct but clinically inseparable. The first is atherosclerosis, the accumulation of inflammatory plaque in the walls of the coronary and peripheral arteries that reduces their lumen, impairs their elasticity, and creates the vulnerable lesions that rupture to produce heart attacks and strokes. The second is myocardial aging, the structural changes to the heart muscle itself, including increased fibrosis, reduced mitochondrial density, impaired calcium handling, and the left ventricular hypertrophy driven by sustained pressure overload that reduce the heart's efficiency as a pump and its resilience in response to physiological demand. Both processes are accelerated by the same upstream inputs: chronic inflammatory load, insulin resistance, sleep insufficiency, physical inactivity, and psychological stress, and both produce their damage in complete symptomatic silence for most of their duration. What they do produce, earlier than most people realize, is a measurable change in the heart's physiological behavior that is detectable if you know how to look. The most informative early signal of casellated cardiac aging is arterial stiffness, the progressive loss of elasticity in the large arteries that normally absorb the pressure wave generated by each cardiac contraction. smoothing out the pulse and reducing the mechanical stress on the heart and on smaller downstream vessels. As arteries stiffen with age, and as that stiffening is accelerated by inflammatory damage, insulin resistance, and sustained pressure elevation, the heart must work harder to overcome the increased resistance, pulse pressure rises, and the downstream organs experience greater pressure variability with each heartbeat. Pulse wave velocity, the clinical measure of arterial stiffness, can be assessed non-invasively and has been shown in multiple prospective studies to predict cardiovascular events more accurately than blood pressure or cholesterol alone. A 2010 meta-analysis, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, found that elevated pulse wave velocity was an independent predictor of cardiovascular mortality, present and measurable years before any clinical event, in people who would have been classified as low to moderate risk by conventional tools. The second accelerated cardiac aging signal is the coronary artery calcium score, a low-radiation CT scan that directly quantifies the calcified plaque present in the coronary arteries and provides a direct, visual measure of the atherosclerotic burden that has been accumulating silently. A score of 0 carries strong prognostic reassurance, particularly in people of intermediate conventional risk. A score above 100 warrants aggressive intervention regardless of what the blood panel shows. And critically, the score changes over time in ways that reflect the biological inputs driving biological ACEs, meaning that repeat scanning over years documents whether the aging of the coronary arteries is accelerating, stable, or slowing in response to lifestyle and clinical intervention. This is not a theoretical tool. It is available in most radiology facilities, costs relatively little in most healthcare systems where it is not covered by insurance, and provides information that no blood test in routine clinical use can approximate. The third dimension of accelerated cardiac aging is the one most accessible to daily observation and the one most consistently normalized away. It is the progressive reduction in heart rate recovery after physical exertion, the speed at which the heart rate returns toward resting levels in the minutes following exercise. Heart rate recovery is regulated by the parasympathetic nervous system, and its speed reflects the health and responsiveness of the autonomic cardiac control that declines as the heart ages. A heart rate that drops by 12 beats or fewer in the first minute after moderate exertion is a clinical indicator of autonomic dysfunction associated with significantly elevated cardiovascular risk. Most people have never measured this. Most would not know what the number means, but it is available to anyone willing to take a brisk walk, note their peak heart rate, and count the beats recovered after 60 seconds of rest. If that number is low, the autonomic age of your heart is worth investigating with considerably more than a routine ECG. So what does all of this mean in practical terms? What are the specific, evidence-based interventions that the research shows to be most effective at slowing and partially reversing the accelerated organ aging we have been discussing across all three systems? The first and most structurally impactful intervention is to consolidate your daily eating into a consistent 8 to 10 hour window, allowing a genuine overnight fast of 14 to 16 hours that restores the metabolic cycling that continuous eating suppresses. During the fasting period, insulin levels fall to their physiological baseline, the liver shifts from processing mode into repair mode, the kidneys recover their nocturnal filtration rhythm, and the cardiovascular system benefits from sustained reduction in post-meal inflammatory and oxidative stress. A 2019 study in Cell Metabolism demonstrated significant reductions in hepatic fat, blood pressure, oxidative stress markers, and insulin sensitivity within 12 weeks of time-restricted eating, without any change in what was eaten or how much. The timing of eating is a biological intervention independent of dietary composition, and its effect on all three organ systems is simultaneous and additive. The second intervention is to address blood pressure with the precision that its impact on renal and cardiovascular aging demands, not simply accepting a reading in the high normal range as adequate, but targeting optimal rather than acceptable values through a combination of dietary sodium reduction, consistent aerobic exercise, adequate sleep, and stress regulation, and supplementing these with pharmacological management when the lifestyle inputs alone are insufficient. The target that the evidence increasingly supports for organ aging prevention is a sustained blood pressure below 120/75, substantially lower than the 140/90 threshold that defines hypertension in most current guidelines. The research distinguishing these targets in terms of renal and cardiovascular aging outcomes is compelling, and the intervention required to achieve the lower target is rarely as demanding as people expect when lifestyle inputs are addressed systematically and simultaneously. The third intervention is to eliminate liquid fructose entirely and to replace ultra-processed food with whole, minimally processed food as the structural default of your daily eating. This single dietary shift addresses accelerated hepatic aging through fructose elimination, accelerated renal aging through sodium reduction, and accelerated cardiac aging through the reduction in small dense LDL production and systemic inflammatory load that a whole food diet consistently produces. A 2022 study in Nature Medicine found that replacing ultra-processed food with whole food equivalents over 8 weeks produced significant reductions in hepatic fat content, blood pressure, inflammatory markers, and insulin resistance simultaneously across all 3 biological axes without any caloric restriction or macronutrient manipulation. The food environment changed, the organ aging decelerated, the biological mechanism was clear and consistent. The fourth intervention is to treat sleep duration, timing, and quality as a primary organ protection strategy, with the same non-negotiability that you would bring to a medication prescribed to slow the progression of organ disease. 7 to 9 hours of consistent, well-timed sleep restores the glymphatic clearance that protects neurological tissue, the nocturnal blood pressure dipping that protects renal microvasculature, the hepatic repair window that reduces fatty liver progression, and the autonomic recovery that maintains cardiac aging at its slowest possible pace. Consistent sleep and wake timing across all 7 days of the week, a cool and dark sleep environment, and the elimination of alcohol and screens in the hour before bed are the 3 most evidence-supported behavioral changes for sleep quality. Together they address the 4th most important modifiable driver of accelerated aging across all 3 organs simultaneously. And the 5th intervention is consistent moderate-intensity aerobic exercise, not intense, not complicated, but genuinely and daily present. The evidence for exercise as an organ anti-aging intervention is among the strongest in all of medicine. It reduces arterial stiffness and pulse wave velocity. It stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis in hepatic and renal tissue. It reduces visceral fat, the primary adipose driver of the systemic inflammation that accelerates aging across all 3 organ systems. It improves heart rate variability and autonomic cardiac control. It enhances renal perfusion and glomerular filtration efficiency. And it does all of this simultaneously in response to a single consistent behavioral input. A 2020 paper in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found that adults engaging in consistent moderate aerobic exercise had cardiovascular biological ages, an average of 9 years younger than sedentary peers of the same chronological age. 9 years. The most potent anti-aging pharmaceutical in development cannot approach that magnitude of effect, and it is available, free of charge, every single day. Here is what I want you to take away from everything covered today. Your organs are not aging at a fixed, predetermined rate. They are aging at the rate dictated by the inputs they receive. Inputs that are, to a degree that the research makes clear and that most people are never told, within your awareness and within your capacity to change. The kidneys filtering your blood right now are aging at a rate that your blood pressure, your hydration habits, your dietary sodium, and your insulin sensitivity are determining in real biological time. The liver processing your last meal is aging at a rate that your fructose intake, your sleep duration, your pharmaceutical burden, and your inflammatory load are governing continuously. The heart pumping blood to both of them is aging at a rate that your arterial stiffness, your autonomic health, your inflammatory environment, and your physical activity level are shaping with every passing day. None of that is fixed, none of it is inevitable. The research on organ biological age reversal is not marginal or preliminary, it is robust, consistent, and pointing in a clear direction. Give these organs different inputs, and they will age at a different rate. The evidence is unambiguous on this point. The only remaining question is whether you will act on it while the window of greatest biological responsiveness is still open. It is open right now. If today gave you the specific understanding to begin using it differently, please like this video and subscribe. There is considerably more coming that I believe will matter to you just as much. I will see you in the next one.